Imagine a lock placed on your own mind, but someone else holds the key, and you don't even know the lock is there.
Yeah, it's a terrifying concept, really.
It is. It really is. So today, if you're a fellow curious learner joining us, we are doing a deep dive into a deeply unsettling, but incredibly important text that explores exactly that scenario.
Right. And we're looking at an essay that delves into the hidden, the philosophical and psychological dimensions of image-based sexual abuse, which is, commonly known as revenge porn.
Exactly. And because this text touches on some deeply sensitive, highly charged societal dynamics, we just want to be super clear right at the top. Our goal today is to impartially unpack the author's philosophical arguments. We're not here to endorse a specific viewpoint, but just to help you understand the core ideas presented in the source.
Yeah, and it is a text that fundamentally reorients how we view this whole issue. Because usually the public conversation centers around the physical violation of privacy,
Right.
or the legal ramifications.
Right, which are obviously critical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the author asks us to look at this through a completely different lens. They focus on something they term epistemological sabotage.
Epistemological sabotage.
Yeah. Basically, we have to examine the actual architecture of human cognition to really understand the long-term devastation of this act.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the core premise of the text is that revenge porn operates as the ultimate confirmation bias, executed with surgical precision against a specific individual. But before we even get into the images themselves, we have to establish a baseline, right? We need to look at the cognitive vulnerabilities that make our brains so susceptible to this kind of sabotage in the first place.
Right, so we really need to rethink our whole definition of confirmation bias. The text makes this foundational argument that we often treat confirmation bias as a glitch, like a flaw found only in broken or highly partisan minds.
Like, oh, that person is just biased.
Exactly. But functionally, the author argues, it is a universal evolutionary feature.
Yeah.
We are at our core pattern-seeking creatures.
Yeah.
Our brains are bombarded with billions of pieces of sensory data every second. And just to survive without being completely paralyzed by information overload, the brain relies on heuristics, shortcuts.
I know my brain loves a shortcut, to be honest. Like, if I decide a coworker is inherently lazy, suddenly every time they take a coffee break or, I don't know, leave 5 minutes early, my brain lights up and says, aha, proof.
Exactly.
And I completely ignore the days they stayed late because, well, that just doesn't fit the pattern. As I was reading the source, I realized it's less like wearing permanently tinted glasses and much more like the algorithm on your social media feed.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Once that algorithm decides you like outrage, it aggressively hides everything else to save processing power and just keep you engaged.
And if we look at the mechanics of that algorithm, it becomes really clear why beliefs are so rigid. When your brain establishes a pattern, say, your belief about that coworker, it creates a predictive model. Incoming data isn't evaluated objectively at all. It's filtered through the existing model. If the data aligns, the neural pathway gets stronger. If the data conflicts, the brain often just discards it.
Just throws it out.
Right, to conserve the caloric energy required to build a completely new model. So you aren't just stubbornly ignoring the times your coworker stays late. Your brain is actively filtering that nuance out before it even reaches your conscious awareness.
Wow. So if the brain's internal algorithm is already built to aggressively filter out nuance, what happens when it's fed a highly volatile piece of data, like an intimate image?
Yeah, that's where the text shifts. It moves from how the mind filters everyday information to how these specific non-consensual images just completely hijack that entire system.
Right.
The author asserts that intimate images do not enter the brain as neutral data. When an image of this nature is shared publicly, it arrives overwhelmingly loaded with implication. It doesn't present itself merely as a photograph. It functions as undeniable evidence that claims to unmask who the subject really is. The intimacy of the image is weaponized to suggest it represents the subject's hidden, authentic self.
Like the dark truth they were supposedly hiding from society.
Exactly.
I'm struggling with this leap the author makes, though. Because if I see a photograph, my brain reflexively registers it as a fact, right? A photo equals reality. We evolved to believe our own eyes.
Sure.
So how does the text justify calling a literal, undoctored photograph a lie or an illusion?
What's fascinating here is how the author deconstructs that exact reflexive leap. The text calls this the illusion of deep knowledge.
The illusion of deep knowledge.
Yeah. The lie isn't necessarily in the pixels of the photograph, right? The lie is in the cognitive leap the viewer makes. Because the image is highly intimate, intrinsically tied to vulnerability and private selfhood, It just bypasses our logical filters completely.
Oh, I see.
In our social evolution, intimacy is usually earned, right?
Yeah.
Through trust and time, so it feels synonymous with authenticity.
Wow.
When a viewer sees an intimate image, their brain subconsciously conflates, "I am seeing something private," with, "I now know the deep, essential truth about this person's character."
So, because intimacy feels like authenticity, the brain basically tricks itself into thinking it has solved the puzzle of who this person is,
Right.
completely ignoring the fact that the image is entirely stripped of its actual context, and obviously, most importantly, stripped of the person's consent.
Precisely that conflation. The cognitive pathway from "I saw a private moment" to "I know this person's core character" is traversed in milliseconds.
That's terrifying.
It is. The viewer experiences a powerful surge of confirmation bias without realizing they've made any leap at all. And the text notes the devastating ripple effect this has across different social spheres.
Yeah, it breaks it down, right?
It does. For people who already harbor negative feelings or rivalry toward the victim, the image instantly anchors their bias. It's the ultimate proof moment. For neutral observers, the image establishes an unbreakable first impression. But the most insidious impact actually happens with allies or sympathetic peers.
Right, because the text argues that even friends find themselves quietly updating their internal models. Like, they might consciously support the victim, but subconsciously, the algorithm has absorbed the quote-unquote evidence.
Exactly.
And because you can't logically debate a visceral image, the victim is left basically powerless to scrub that cognitive imprint from the minds of the people around them.
Yeah, the image does its damage at the level of raw perception, not rational argument. By the time the victim attempts to offer context or, a defense, the audience's predictive models have already been rewritten.
Here's where it gets really interesting and frankly terrifying to read. Once that false narrative is implanted, the text describes the victim as being trapped in a self-sealing frame.
Yes, the self-sealing frame.
It's like walking into a rigged courtroom where the judge takes every piece of evidence meant to prove your innocence and literally twists it to prove your guilt.
The mechanics of that self-sealing frame rely heavily on what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, combined with that nudie rigid confirmation bias we talked about.
Okay.
Because the viewer's brain now knows the victim's supposed true nature, every future action the victim takes is processed through this contaminated lens. The frame literally seals itself shut, deflecting any contradictory data.
The examples the author gives are just brutal. Like, if the victim continues their life and manages to succeed brilliantly in their career, the contaminated lens makes the viewer think, oh, of course they are succeeding. Look at how shameless and calculating they are.
Right. Everything is twisted.
Yeah. And if the victim bravely speaks out and advocates for themselves, it's dismissed as performative or attention-seeking. But then, if they retreat from public life and fail, the viewer nods and says, see, the shame broke them, I knew it. There is literally no move the victim can make on the chessboard that doesn't result in a checkmate.
That is the absolute essence of a self-sealing frame. And to understand the full scope of this dynamic, the text introduces the concept of the asymmetry of perception.
The asymmetry of perception.
Right, yeah. While the victim is trapped inside this rigged cognitive courtroom, the perpetrator, the person who actually committed the violation by distributing the image, faces almost no equivalent cognitive contamination.
It's wild. The public doesn't put the perpetrator in a self-sealing frame at all. If anything, they often just fade into the background of the narrative entirely.
They really do. And the text argues this happens because of a societal-level confirmation bias. We already carry these deeply ingrained, often subconscious cultural narratives about who is inherently trustworthy, who is supposed to carry shame, and who gets to claim victimhood.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Society has pre-existing cognitive buckets for judging a person exposed in an intimate image, but we lack equally potent reflexive buckets for the person who shares it. So this asymmetry means the perpetrator leverages societal biases, directing all the destructive energy like a laser beam onto a single target while remaining relatively untouched themselves.
So if society is readily accepting this distorted lens, what is happening to the person who actually built the lens? Like, let's look at the perpetrator's mindset for a second.
Okay.
Are they just acting out of pure chaotic cruelty, or is the text arguing that there is a mechanical cognitive distortion happening on their end, too?
It is a profound cognitive distortion. The author explains that the perpetrator is heavily driven by their own confirmation bias. Often these acts stem from a perceived grievance or rejection, right? The perpetrator has already cemented a narrative in their mind that the victim is bad, deceitful, or deserving of punishment. But rather than just holding that belief privately, they take an intimate image and release it.
Right.
This isn't just an act of exposure. It is an attempt to force the external world to confirm their internal distorted reality.
They use the viral nature of the internet to forcefully install their own mental algorithm into the minds of thousands of strangers.
The text uses a really chilling phrase for this mechanism: epistemological imperialism.
Wow.
Yeah. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge, truth, and how we know what we know. By distributing the image, the perpetrator acts as an imperialist, quite literally colonizing the minds of the public.
Colonizing their minds.
They strip the victim of their right to define their own narrative, and they replace it with the perpetrator's biased, authored version of reality. They're dictating what the world knows to be true about the victim.
Epistemological imperialism. That perfectly captures the mechanics of it. They are using visual data as a Trojan horse to colonize reality.
Exactly.
But the text doesn't stop at the public's perception, which is, well, it pivots to what is arguably the most heartbreaking dimension: the survivor's internal confirmation bias. Because the colonization doesn't just happen out in the world, right? The humiliation breaches the walls and reaches inside the victim.
And that internal breach is where the deepest psychological damage occurs. The author points out that massive, non-consensual exposure doesn't just change how others see the survivor. It triggers a cascade of internal cognitive distortions.
Yeah.
Every human being carries baseline insecurities, everyday shame, fears of inadequacy, low self-worth. When a targeted campaign of public humiliation occurs, it finds those pre-existing internal wounds and seemingly validates them.
It basically rewires the victim's self-perception. Their own brain looks at the thousands of strangers judging them and says, see, I always secretly suspected I was unworthy, and now the entire world is providing the evidence. It turns the victim's own cognitive machinery against them.
And this is exactly why the psychological harm is described in the text as totalizing. Even if the survivor knows intellectually that the perpetrator is in the wrong and the image does not define their worth. Cognitive science tells us that raw knowledge does not easily override the deeply entrenched neural pathways of shame. The mind absorbs the scale of the external humiliation and integrates it as internal self-evidence.
Wow.
The external colonization becomes an internal occupation.
And that totalizing effect brings us to why the traditional forms of justice we usually rely on fall so short, I think. An apology, a legal settlement, or a court order forcing the images to be taken down. Those things are important, obviously.
Of course.
But they don't fix the cognitive machinery. They don't uninstall the algorithm once it's running.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the neuroscience behind why false beliefs are so resilient. The text points to the cognitive science concept of the backfire effect.
The backfire effect.
Yeah. When you present someone with factual evidence that directly challenges a deeply held belief or a confirmed pattern, the brain doesn't just calmly process the new data. Functional MRI scans actually show that the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes physical threats, often lights up.
Are you serious?
Yeah. The brain treats the challenge to its predictive model as a literal physical attack.
So the brain essentially goes into fight or flight mode just because it's being told it's wrong about someone.
Yes. And as a defense mechanism, the brain chemically doubles down, physically strengthening the neural pathways of the original false belief. That is the backfire effect.
Unbelievable.
So even if a court of law publicly exonerates the victim and proves the narrative around the image was maliciously fabricated, attempting to correct the public's perception can sometimes accidentally deepen the original bias.
That is incredibly bleak. Even the truth can be weaponized by the brain's defense systems. But the author also talks about trace contamination, which implies that even when the truth does get through, the damage isn't fully undone.
Right. Trace contamination refers to the cognitive residue left behind. Even if the viewer consciously accepts the correction, even if they say, you know, I understand that image was shared without consent and the narrative was a lie. Human memory does not work like a hard drive. You can't just delete a file and have pristine empty space. Memory retrieval is reconstructive. Every time the viewer thinks of the victim, they have to navigate around the cognitive residue of the initial shock and judgment. The slate is never wiped clean. The impression lingers, subtly coloring interactions for years.
So synthesizing the backfire effect, trace contamination, and the self-sealing frame. The text gives us its ultimate terminology for what this crime truly is. It's not just a privacy violation, it is the violation of epistemic safety.
The violation of epistemic safety is the profound conclusion of the author's argument here. Epistemic safety is presented as a fundamental human right. It is the right to be known authentically, dynamically, and over time, with the full complexity of your actual lived context.
Right, because we all rely on a baseline assumption that the world will allow us to author our own identity.
Exactly, and revenge porn completely annihilates this safety. It forcefully extracts a person from their context, replaces them in the public mind with a corrupted, perpetrator-authored distortion, and does so using cognitive mechanisms that offer absolutely no avenue for correction.
So, what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now? How does this deep dive into a very specific, heavy philosophical text translate to your everyday life?
It's a great question.
The author is essentially holding up a mirror to our own cognitive architecture. It asks us to look at how we consume viral content and to acknowledge the massive, often invisible responsibility we carry as consumers of digital information. We have to ask ourselves, have we ever unwittingly participated in stripping away someone's epistemic safety? Have we ever looked at an out-of-context image or a viral video, felt that instant illusion of deep knowledge, and allowed our own mental algorithms to lock a stranger into a self-sealing frame?
It's definitely something we all need to reflect on.
It is a stark reminder of how easily our own minds, our desire for patterns and shortcuts, can be turned into a weapon against someone else just by lingering on a post or accepting a narrative without friction.
It demands a much higher level of cognitive vigilance from all of us. The work of understanding this harm isn't just about recognizing a specific form of abuse.
Right.
It's about recognizing how fragile perception really is.
Yeah.
Once these bias frames are set, they fiercely resist correction. The architecture of human cognition is incredibly efficient, but as this text so clearly demonstrates, that efficiency makes it highly vulnerable to being hijacked and weaponized.
It really does. Well, thank you for joining us on this intense but absolutely vital deep dive into the architecture of perception and the true nature of epistemological sabotage. It requires us to look at some really uncomfortable truths about how our brains operate, but, understanding the mechanism is the only way to start dismantling it.
I completely value the opportunity to unpack such a profound perspective on human cognition with you today. By shifting the focus from the digital image to the cognitive machinery, the author really reframes the entire conversation in a way that is impossible to ignore.
It changes everything about how we view digital media, and we want to leave you with a final, lingering question to mull over on your own, a thought that builds on the mechanics we've just discussed. The text proves how easily a single, out-of-context image can colonize our minds and completely destroy someone's epistemic safety. It forces us to ask an unsettling question. If our fundamental cognitive architecture is this vulnerable to visual evidence, and if our brains are constantly filtering out nuance to protect our predictive models, are we ever truly the authors of our own beliefs?
Wow.
When you look at the world through a screen today, how much of what you quote-unquote know about anyone is the objective truth, and how much is just your own confirmation bias reflecting back at you? Take care, and we will catch you on the next one.